All right, guys, so this is supposed to get you ready for the quiz, which will be Monday. So photosynthesis. First place you ought to start is by knowing the equation for photosynthesis. So let's write it out up here on the board. You have to memorize it, yes. You need to know the whole thing. So first of all, plants have to have light. They have to have some carbon dioxide. They have to have some water. Those are the things they need to do photosynthesis. And then what they end up getting as a result of doing it is, first of all, glucose, sugar, and some oxygen gas. Now, the way that's written right now, that equation is not balanced. There's not the same amount of carbons on each side and hydrogens. So Brandon's saying let's put a coefficient of 6 there, a coefficient of 6 there, and a coefficient of 6 there. You need to know that equation. And notice the second item up here says that you need to be able to identify the reactants and the products. Remember, the things on the left, these things, these are the reactants. The things that a plant needs to be able to do photosynthesis. And then the things on the right, those are the products. That's what the plant makes as a result. And what's the little arrow called? It's called the yield sign. All right, so we talked about the equation. We talked about reactants and products. Notice number 3 up here. Know how plants obtain the reactants and what they use the products for. How do plants get carbon dioxide? Yeah, so the little holes that are located where? On the bottom of their leaves, and those are called stomata or stomates. Water, they get through their roots, right? And the light is absorbed by what? By what? Yeah, mostly which pigment? What's the main pigment? Chlorophyll, right? I compared chlorophyll to what? Human machine. It's like a solar panel. So that's how the plant gets those things. That's how it gets its reactants. Now, in terms of what it uses the products for, the main reason it's doing photosynthesis is to make which one of these two things over here on the right? It's doing it to make glucose. And glucose, what's its function in the plant? Food. And it's food. So they make the glucose for energy. The oxygen, do plants need oxygen?
Yes.
Yeah, they need some to do what process? Yeah, aerobic respiration, aerobic cell respiration, but they make more than they need. So a lot of it's just given off. And again, how does it get out? Through the pores in the leaves, the stomata. So I think we covered everything on this first slide. Anybody have questions about this stuff? Should be basic stuff. Let's look at the second one. The next thing says know the 2 stages of photosynthesis. What's the first part of photosynthesis called? Light dependent reactions. That has to happen first. The second stage is sometimes just called light what? Yeah, but it's sometimes called light what? Independent, but most of the time we're going to call it the Calvin cycle. So this has to happen first. It has to have light. This happens second. It doesn't need light, but it can happen in the light. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Now, the next step says be able to describe the location where each stage occurs. Now, let's start big picture first. The light-dependent reactions. If we're starting like big parts of a plant, where does that happen? Yeah, bigger. Bigger. Smaller. The leaf. Okay? So it happens in the leaf, and then we're going to zoom in on one cell, and then we're going to zoom in further on one what? Yeah, which organelle? Chloroplast. And then we're going to zoom in even further on what part of the chloroplast. The little thylakoids, the little bags of chlorophyll inside a chloroplast. So the correct answer here would be a thylakoid membrane. Remember, those little thylakoids look almost like little stacks of pancakes inside a chloroplast. And embedded in their membrane are lots of little proteins, which we'll look at in a minute. Do they do what? If they made too much, would they bust? Is that what you're saying? No, because it's not really inside. It's in the membrane. It's like if this was the membrane, it's sticking through it like that. So no, it shouldn't. All right, so we got the thylakoid membrane for the light-dependent reactions. The Calvin cycle, on the other hand, it happens where?
In the stroma.
Yep. It happens in the stroma. We'll look at a picture of a chloroplast here in a minute. But essentially, this is the fluid-filled space inside a chloroplast. We'll talk about what that is in a second. I'll show you in the picture. And then the other thing on this slide, be able to identify the products of each stage. Know what gets made during each of those two stages. And I'm oversimplifying here, but the light-dependent reactions happen first. They take in light. They take in light, and they store that light energy in two forms. Anybody know what two forms that light energy gets stored into?
ATP.
Yeah.
Isn't that free though?
I heard.
NADP.
Yeah, I heard ATP and NADPH. And we'll talk about in a minute how both of those get made. But those are both forms of energy that a plant stores during the light-dependent reactions. One other thing gets made: oxygen gas. And remember that the oxygen gas that gets made is a result of what getting torn apart? Water. So these are the three main things that get made during the first stage of photosynthesis, the light-dependent stage. And then remember in the Calvin cycle, essentially what happens in the Calvin cycle is the plant takes in what gas? Carbon dioxide. And essentially it adds to that carbon dioxide what? What's the Calvin cycle all about? Adding what to carbon dioxide?
Water.
Adding energy from here, ATP, and from here, NADPH. So essentially the Calvin cycle is about charging up the CO2, putting several of them together, and eventually ending up with what?
Sugar.
Sugar. And we'll call it glucose. But it could be several different forms of sugar. But for right now, that is the main product of the Calvin cycle. That's the one product you need to know for the Calvin cycle. Glucose, sugar. Any questions on this slide?
Can you keep the slides just here?
Yeah. All right, what we'll look at on the next slide, I think the very next slide is a picture of just a chloroplast. We'll talk about it. And then we'll talk a little bit about how each one of these stages works. We'll go from there. Got what you need? Yeah. Calvin cycle makes sugar. Yes, ma'am. All right, this is a picture of one chloroplast. This whole thing right here, that's a chloroplast. Now remember, in a cell, in a plant cell, how many of those chloroplasts would there be? A bunch. You saw plant cells under the microscope. You know there's a bunch of those in there. If we zoom in on this plant cell, each one of these little discs right here, those are thylakoids. And like we said before, what's in the membrane of those thylakoids? Chlorophyll. Okay. Other pigments. And some other important proteins for photosynthesis. But in particular, those thylakoids, that's where the chlorophyll's at. Say again now? A whole stack of those thylakoids, on the other hand, is called a granum. That's a whole stack of thylakoids like that. And then remember, the Calvin cycle happens out in the fluid-filled space in between all this. So just the fluid-filled area between all those thylakoids, that's the stroma. That's where the Calvin cycle. Should we ask what now? No, chlorophyll is a protein. It'd be a solid material. All right, another thing that we need to mention here. This is a picture of just one of those thylakoids. Just one of those little pancake-shaped things that's been blown up. And there's a lot more on this diagram than you really need to know for purposes of regular biology. But a quick overview of how the light-dependent reactions happen. Light shines down. You've got a group of pigments like chlorophyll right there. It's called photosystem number 2. You've got another group of pigments over here. We said to think of those again like what? What do pigments do? Absorb light. Solar panels. Think of them like the plant solar panels. Those things are absorbing light, and as they absorb more and more energy, what starts jiggling around inside those atoms really fast? Electrons. Until eventually, some of those electrons get shot out, almost like in a beam. It's not really a beam, but sort of like a beam. So photosystem 2 shoots out some electrons, so does photosystem 1. Those electrons are moving, which means they have what? Kinetic energy. But where'd that energy come from? What made them move in the first place?
Heat.
Sunlight, right? Yeah, it's the sun. So essentially they're moving because of the sun. Well, the electron that leaves photosystem 2 hops across a series of proteins, and it ends up going to photosystem 1. So 1 lost an electron, it got 1 back. It's a happy camper, right? Lost 1, gained 1. It's good. But the electrons that photosystem 1 lost end up combining with this thing right here, NADP+, out in the stroma rather of the cell, to make NADPH. Remember, this electron's bringing energy with it, right? I told you to think of NADP+ like what? Like a battery that needs to be what? Charged, and we just charged it. The plant just charged it. We can't do this, right? So we make NADPH. One form of stored energy that used to be in the sun. All right, the next thing that happens. As these electrons are leaving photosystem 2 and headed toward photosystem 1, their energy is used to pump H+, hydrogen ions, from outside the thylakoid inside, like that. And they're pumping them, which means they're doing active transport. They're moving them against the gradient. So they're building up a lot of H+ inside that thylakoid membrane. Is that the way nature wants things to be? No. Those H+, and I'm making them sound like a person here, but the H+ want to get out, right? But why can't they get out? Yeah, they're H+, and the membrane is a non-polar membrane mostly, right? And they don't like each other, so they're stuck. The more H+ get in, the more they want to get out, right? So we're building up what inside that membrane? Energy, potential energy. There's one way out. Yeah, go ahead. That's actually the next thing I'm going to mention, because that's the word we haven't used yet. These H+ want to get out. The way out is through this little protein right here. It's called ATP synthase. It's a channel protein. I compared it yesterday to one of those wheels you put under a waterfall. And when the water turns, the wheel turns, the wheel's probably hooked up to what? The generator, and it makes electricity. Well, when this little channel opens, these H+ shoot out. They shoot out really fast because there's a really big what? Yeah, but there's a big difference in what? Concentration. And those things shoot out with a whole lot of what kind of energy? Kinetic. And this enzyme is cool because it's able to take that energy and it's able to put the chemicals ADP and P together to make ATP. Huge important process. Again, ATP is another form of stored what? Energy. In this case, energy that used to be where? Where did the energy come from to make it? The sun, ultimately. This way of making ATP using H pluses and ATP synthase is a word that I don't think we've mentioned before. This will show up again when we talk about cell respiration later. It's called chemiosmosis. So it's a way to make ATP using energy from H plus ions and using ATP synthase. And again, I think that's a word we haven't mentioned yet. But like I said a minute ago, three main things get made during the light dependent part of photosynthesis. NADPH, a form of stored energy. ATP, another form of stored energy. And the other product we hadn't talked about yet. Photosystem 2 lost electrons. It needs to get some back, right? Where does it get them back from? Water. It rips it apart, steals electrons. And one of the things that's left over from a ripped apart water is oxygen. So the oxygen that you are breathing right now started out in a water molecule. And a plant ripped that water molecule apart and released some of that oxygen into the air, and that's what you breathe today. Go ahead.
Humidity in the air. Is that because some water's so wet with the oxygen not enough to make a difference for it is water?
No, that humidity in the air can come from anything. It can come from the ocean, it can come from a lake, it can come from water evaporating from anywhere. Yeah. It's a process of making ATP using energy from a hydrogen ion gradient. The movement of hydrogen ions. Making ATP using energy from moving H pluses. Probably as complicated as we need to get into it. All right, so three things again in the light-dependent reactions: ATP, NADPH, oxygen gas. Yes, sir.
So, do electrons help make NADPH, or like, because it's given H?
The electrons provide the energy to charge up NAD plus, so it becomes NADPH. So that's where the energy comes from to charge the
So
battery.
the H and H is hydrogen.
H is hydrogen. We'll get there in just a second. All right, here's the Kelvin cycle. And again, Kelvin cycle is pretty complicated stuff. You don't need to know much of what's in this diagram. What you do need to know is that the Kelvin cycle happens out in the stroma, that fluid-filled space of the chloroplast. The plant takes in CO2 and essentially adds to it energy from ATP and energy from NADPH. Both of those came from where? Where did both of these things come from? The first part, the light dependent stage. So we're adding that energy to the CO2 until eventually we end up with some form of sugar. We're going to say glucose, but it could be other forms of sugar. Glucose, though, is the main product of the Kelvin cycle. And remember, the Kelvin cycle can happen during the day, it can happen during the night.
Because it doesn't require light.
It doesn't require light. It doesn't mean light hurts it or stops it, it just doesn't need light. All right, we got one more topic we need to talk about. And that's the different forms of light and how they're related to each other. So one thing you need to know is what these parts of this equation up here stand for. C is what?
Constant.
Constant. And what's constant? Speed of light. Stands for the speed of light. This funny symbol right here, what's the name for that symbol?
I don't know.
No, wait,
I don't know the name.
Yeah, but the actual name of the letter. It's lambda. It's a Greek letter, lambda. But it stands for what about a wave? It's length, wavelength. So lambda, wavelength. And F is what? Frequency. Remember, wavelength is how long is a wave from one point on one wave to that same point on the next wave. Frequency is essentially a measurement of how many waves happen when? Every second. How frequent they are. Waves per second.
Yes.
So here's the deal. If this is constant, if the speed of light is constant, if a form of wave has a really long wavelength, what does that mean about its frequency?
It's short.
It's short, it's low. If it has a really high frequency, it's going to have what? A really short wavelength. They're inversely proportional. Another thing we need to mention, which one of these things, wavelength or frequency, is directly proportional to how much energy a wave has? Frequency. Higher frequency means more what? More energy. And we'll look at a diagram and help explain it more in a minute. But higher frequency means more energy. Somebody asked a question a minute ago about a photon. What's photon?
Measurement of light.
It's the smallest unit of light you can have. It's like a particle of light. It's a very tiny particle of light.
What is light made out of? I mean, there's like.
That's a good question. And people have been debating that for years. Whether it's made out of little pieces, little particles, or whether it's made out of waves. And the answer that scientists would currently say is yes. Both. Because there are some properties, seems like it's like a beam of little particles. Some properties rather seem like it's waves.
I got a question.
Yes.
Earlier yesterday you said that what made light was electrons and light.
What? Say again.
You said that yesterday what made up light was electrons and light.
I think you misunderstood what I said there. No, I was talking about what made the light come on was the electricity, which was the movement of electrons to the light. The actual light's not made up of the electrons, no. All right, this diagram, electromagnetic spectrum. These are different forms, essentially, of what? Different forms of light, right? Different forms of light waves. Down here at the bottom, gamma rays. This diagram is showing you they have a very low what? What's low about gamma rays? Low wavelength.
High frequency.
So we'll say low wavelength, therefore they have a high frequency, and they also have a really huge amount of what? Huge amount of energy. Gamma rays are dangerous, right? On the other hand, up here, radio waves. They have a very long what? Long wavelength, a very low frequency, and therefore very little what? Energy. One other thing I'll mention. I'll mention just a second. Invisible light, right here. That's the only part of this we can see. And remember that the way it fits in sort of like Roy G. Biv, where R is the highest one on this list, and violet is the lowest one on this list. So this Roy G. Biv bit fits in right here in this yellow spot. What does that mean about violet light? Highest frequency, lowest wavelength, most energy. Where red light has the longest what? Longest wavelength, shortest, lowest frequency, least amount of energy. All right, you had a question. That's a stack of thylakoids in a chloroplast. All right, and then the very last thing in terms of the review is this. This is an absorption spectrum. We've seen it several times. And this thing is supposed to be showing you the colors of light, the wavelengths of light that chlorophyll absorbs. And according to this diagram, chlorophyll is pretty good at absorbing what? Pretty good at absorbing bluish violet. It's really good at absorbing that. That's what it's best at. Best at this. Second best at sort of reddish orange. And then in this area, it stinks at absorbing those colors, right? Chlorophyll is not good at absorbing blue or yellows, and that's why plants tend to be what? They tend to be green because they're reflecting green. We see what gets reflected. Plants are using the blue, and they're using the red, and they're using the blues and the reds to do what? To do what process? Photosynthesis. Now remember, one other thing we said, this is an important question. A lot of people have asked, well, why aren't plants black? Because if they're black, that means they're doing what? absorbing all the colors. Why did we say that might not be such a good idea for plants?
Because they're just
They'd be absorbing so much heat they would get too wet.
hot.
They'd get too hot, and the heat would probably kill them. All right, that's where we're going to stop on the review video. Those are the things that will be on your quiz. Expect it to be about 15 to 20 questions.